The business card hit Robert's windshield with a sharp snap. Through the glass, you could see Margaret Holloway, better known throughout Oak Ridge Estates as HOA Karen, tapping her foot impatiently, arms crossed over her crisp beige blazer. Her platinum blonde bob didn't move an inch in the autumn breeze. Robert sighed and rolled down his window. "That's your third warning this month, Mr. Chen," Margaret announced, her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac where several neighbors were pretending not to watch. "Your garbage bins remained visible from the street for 27 hours after collection. The bylaws clearly state 24 hours maximum." Robert glanced at the business card now in his hand. Margaret Holloway, HOA president, enforcing excellence, was printed in bold serif font with a tiny American flag in the corner. "Margaret, I was at my mother's hospital." "The bylaws don't make exceptions for personal circumstances," she interrupted, already turning away. "Next time it's a fine. $300. As Margaret walked away, her designer heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement, Robert noticed her SUV partially blocking his driveway again. The fifth time this month. Somehow the no parking within 5 feet of a driveway rule never seemed to apply to the HOA president herself. 3 doors down, Margaret paused to examine Jessica Miller's newly planted rose bushes with narrowed eyes, measuring tape already in hand. Inside her immaculate 2-story colonial, Margaret settled at her kitchen island with her leather-bound HOA notebook and a glass of Pinot Grigio. Her husband Tom knew better than to interrupt compliance hour, the sacred time when Margaret documented the day's infractions. "The Chen situation is escalating," she murmured to herself, making a note. "And the Miller's rose bushes are 2 inches taller than the approved landscape plan." Tom grunted noncommittally from behind his newspaper. "Don't you start," Margaret snapped. "Someone has to maintain standards around here. Property values don't protect themselves." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her fellow board member Diane. "Emergency meeting tomorrow." The Paddles submitted a request to paint their front door teal. Margaret gasped audibly. The HOA-approved color palette for Oak Ridge Estates included exactly 4 shades of acceptable front door colors: forest green, navy blue, burgundy, and black. Teal wasn't just unapproved, it was revolutionary. "Absolutely," she typed back. "My house, 10 a.m. This needs to be shut down immediately." What Margaret didn't know was that Robert Chen had watched her park in front of his driveway again. And this time, he wasn't just going to sigh and maneuver around her car. Robert was a military history professor at the local university, and he had resources most people didn't, including a friend who owned a decommissioned Sherman tank. As Margaret finished her wine and added the final notes to her compliance log, she had no idea that her perfect, orderly world was about to face its greatest challenge yet. And it would begin with the rumble of tank treads on pristine suburban asphalt. Morning sunlight streamed through Margaret's kitchen windows as she arranged freshly baked lemon scones on her grandmother's china. The emergency HOA board meeting regarding the Paddles' teal door rebellion would begin in 20 minutes, and everything needed to be perfect. "Diane will be early as usual," Margaret told Tom, who was hurriedly finishing his coffee before escaping to the golf course. "And make sure you're back by 2. We're doing the walkthrough of the Peterson property today." Tom nodded without looking up from his phone. After 15 years of marriage to Margaret, he'd mastered the art of appearing attentive while mentally elsewhere. Across the street, Robert Chen was on the phone with his old college roommate, Jason. "So you're serious about this?" Jason asked, sounding both amused and concerned. "You actually want to park Sherman in a suburban neighborhood?" "Just for a day," Robert assured him. "And technically, it's not against any HOA rules. I checked the bylaws twice. They specify restrictions on commercial vehicles, RVs, and boats, nothing about historical military vehicles." "Sherman hasn't moved in months," Jason said. "But for you, I'll dust her off. That HOA lady sounds like she needs a reality check." Meanwhile, Margaret's meeting was in full swing. Diane, Barbara, and Walter, the other HOA board members, sat around Margaret's dining table, examining the Paddles' door color requests with the gravity of national security analysts reviewing intelligence. "It sets a dangerous precedent," Margaret declared, passing around color swatches. "Today it's teal, tomorrow it's neon pink. Where does it end?" "The Paddles mentioned cultural significance," Barbara said hesitantly, adjusting her glasses. "Apparently this specific shade has meaning in Indian tradition." Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "This is America. We have our own traditions here in Oak Ridge Estates, and they're clearly outlined in Section 4.3 of the bylaws." Walter, who hadn't spoken yet, cleared his throat. "Maybe we could consider a compromise, a slightly more subdued version of teal." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Compromise undermines consistency, Walter. You of all people should understand that property values depend on uniformity." As the meeting concluded with a unanimous rejection of the Paddles' request, though Barbara's no was noticeably reluctant, a low rumbling sound gradually became audible from outside. "Is that construction?" Diane asked, peering toward the window. I don't remember approving any permits this week. Margaret frowned, standing to investigate. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by what sounded like metal treads on asphalt. Neighbors were emerging from their homes, pointing and staring down the street. "What in heaven's name?" Margaret muttered, moving to her front door. The sight that greeted her made her perfectly glossed lips part in shock. Crawling slowly down Oak Ridge Drive was an actual tank, olive green, massive, and headed directly toward her house. Behind the tank, a growing procession of neighbors followed, many filming with their phones. "Tom!" Margaret shrieked, but her husband had already left for golf. The tank came to a stop precisely at the edge of Margaret's property line. The hatch opened and Robert Chen emerged, wearing a vintage tanker's helmet. He surveyed the crowd before his eyes locked with Margaret's. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," he called pleasantly. "Beautiful day for a history demonstration, isn't it?" Margaret stood frozen on her front porch, the HOA board members clustered behind her like startled birds. The Sherman tank dominated the street, its massive bulk making even the largest SUVs in the neighborhood look like toys. "Mr. Chen," Margaret finally managed, her voice higher than usual. "This is completely unacceptable. Remove this contraption immediately." Robert climbed down from the tank with surprising agility, a folder tucked under his arm. The growing crowd of neighbors murmured and pointed, smartphones recording every moment. "Actually, Mrs. Holloway," Robert replied calmly, "I've reviewed the HOA bylaws thoroughly." He opened the folder and extracted a highlighted document. Section 7.2 restricts commercial vehicles, recreational vehicles, and boats. There's no mention of historical military vehicles. Diane stepped forward, snatching the document from Robert's hands. "This is absurd. Clearly the spirit of the rule." "The spirit?" Robert interrupted, his eyebrows raised. "Interesting concept. Like the spirit of the rule prohibiting parking within 5 feet of a driveway, the one Mrs. Holloway violates weekly when she blocks my access." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Several neighbors nodded in recognition. Margaret's cheeks flushed crimson. "That's completely different. As HOA president, I sometimes need to make brief stops while performing my duties. Which is why," Robert continued smoothly, "I'm parked completely legally, not blocking anyone's driveway, not on anyone's property. And best of all," he gestured to the tank, "Sherman here is fully decommissioned, insured, and registered as a historical vehicle with the state." Jessica Miller stepped forward from the crowd. "Margaret, you made me tear out my children's basketball hoop because it was visible from the street. And you fined me for having a bird feeder that was 2 inches taller than regulation," added elderly Mr. Kowalski. The crowd's energy was shifting, years of accumulated resentment suddenly finding a focal point. Margaret sensed the change and straightened her spine, summoning her most authoritative voice. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced to the board members. "Mr. Chen, you'll be receiving formal notice of violation by tomorrow morning." As Margaret retreated into her house, the crowd lingered, many approaching Robert to get a closer look at the tank. Children were particularly delighted, begging to sit in the commander's seat while parents took photos. Inside, Margaret paced her living room furiously. Phone pressed to her ear. "Tom, you need to come home now. This is an emergency." "Can't, Margaret," Tom replied, the sounds of the golf course audible in the background. "Tournament's just starting. Handle it like you handle everything else." Margaret hung up and dialed the police instead. 20 minutes later, Officer Rivera arrived, looking bemused as he surveyed the tank and the impromptu neighborhood gathering around it. "Ma'am," he explained after checking Robert's documentation, "everything appears to be in order. The vehicle is legally registered and parked according to city ordinances. But the HOA bylaws," Margaret began, "are a civil matter." Officer Rivera finished gently, "Not enforceable by police. You need to pursue this through your normal HOA procedures." As the officer left, Margaret spotted Diane and Barbara across the street, actually taking turns sitting in the tank while Robert explained its history. Even Walter was there, examining the treads with fascination. Behind her closed door, Margaret's humiliation turned to steely resolve. This wasn't just about a tank anymore. It was an insurrection. And Margaret Holloway had not maintained her position as HOA president for 7 consecutive terms by backing down from a fight. She reached for her phone again, this time scrolling to a contact she rarely used. Her brother-in-law, a partner at the most aggressive law firm in the city. By evening, the tank had become Oak Ridge Estate's unlikely social hub. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years gathered around it, sharing stories of their own run-ins with Margaret and the HOA. Someone brought folding chairs. The Millers arrived with a cooler of drinks. The Paddles contributed samosas from their family restaurant, pointedly served on teal paper plates. From behind her living room curtains, Margaret watched the impromptu block party with mounting fury. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother-in-law. "Reviewing case law. Complicated situation. We'll call tomorrow." "This is unbelievable," she muttered, snapping photos of the gathering for evidence. Through her zoom lens, she could see Barbara, her most reliable board ally, laughing with the Chen family. Betrayal stung sharply. When Tom finally returned from golf, Margaret practically ambushed him at the door. "Where have you been? It's almost 7. Tom glanced past her to the scene outside. "Is that a tank?" "Yes, it's a tank. Robert Chen brought a tank to our neighborhood, and nobody's doing anything about it." Margaret's voice rose dangerously. "The police were useless. The board is socializing with the enemy, and you've been golfing all day." Tom set down his clubs and moved to the window. "Looks like everyone's having fun." "Fun?" Margaret's eyes widened. "This is anarchy, Tom. Everything I've built is falling apart because of one disgruntled resident and his military connection." Tom watched the scene thoughtfully. "You know, Margaret, maybe. Don't you dare suggest compromise," she cut him off. "I know exactly what needs to happen." Upstairs in her home office, Margaret dug through filing cabinets until she found what she was looking for, the original neighborhood covenant from 1965, before several revisions had modernized the language. She smiled tightly as she photographed a specific paragraph and sent it to the HOA board group chat with the message, "Emergency meeting. My house. 8 a.m. tomorrow." Across the street, Robert was describing tank mechanics to an enraptured audience when his next-door neighbor, Elena, approached. "This is brilliant," she said quietly. "But you know she won't give up easily." Robert nodded. "I'm counting on it, actually." "What do you mean?" "Margaret's been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom for too long," Robert explained. "The tank is just phase 1. Elena raised an eyebrow. "There's a phase 2? Robert smiled. "Let's just say I've been documenting every selective enforcement, every double standard, and every questionable financial decision that HOA has made under Margaret's leadership. And I'm not the only one." As the evening progressed, the gathering began to take on a more organized feel. Jessica Miller, a former event planner, had started a sign-up sheet for a neighborhood committee. The Kowalskis were distributing printed copies of the current bylaws, encouraging everyone to review them before a proposed meeting. What had begun as a protest was rapidly evolving into a movement. At 9 p.m., Margaret emerged from her house for the first time since retreating hours earlier. The sight that greeted her made her stop short. Lawn chairs arranged in a semicircle, string lights borrowed from someone's patio illuminating the gathering, and at least 30 neighbors still present, engaged in serious conversation. Her arrival created an immediate lull in the chatter. All eyes turned toward her. Margaret squared her shoulders and approached the group, her gaze fixed on Robert. "Enjoy your little rebellion while it lasts, Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "This will all be settled tomorrow." Robert merely smiled. "Looking forward to it, Mrs. Holloway." As Margaret walked stiffly back to her house, she didn't notice Tom slipping out the side door, heading toward the gathering with 2 bottles of wine in hand. At 7:55 a.m., Margaret arranged 5 copies of her secret weapon, the original covenant, around her dining room table. Each stapled packet was accompanied by a highlighter and a notepad. Her hair was freshly styled, her navy blazer pressed to perfection. This meeting would put everything back in order. The doorbell rang at 7:58. Diana arrived first, followed quickly by Walter. Barbara was uncharacteristically late, arriving with tousled hair and the unmistakable scent of the paddles chai tea on her breath. "I stopped by their restaurant on my way," Barbara explained, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. "They open early for breakfast." Margaret pressed her lips together but said nothing. The final board member, Harold, called to say his car wouldn't start. Sherman could probably jump-start it. Walter joked under his breath, earning a glare from Margaret and a smothered laugh from Barbara. "Let's begin," Margaret announced, gesturing to the documents. "I've discovered something significant." The board members dutifully examined the highlighted section of the 1965 covenant. "No military equipment, functional or otherwise, shall be displayed or stored within view of any public or private roadway within the development." "This predates all our current bylaws," Margaret explained triumphantly. "It's part of the original property covenant, which supersedes our HOA rules." Diane nodded approvingly. Walter looked thoughtful. Barbara frowned. "Isn't this the same covenant that prohibited selling homes to, and I quote, persons of color?" Barbara asked quietly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. "That section was nullified by federal law decades ago," Margaret said sharply. "But the rest remains legally binding." "I'm not sure that's how it works," Walter said slowly. "If parts of a covenant are deemed discriminatory and illegal, the entire document's validity becomes questionable." Margaret's confident smile faltered. "We need to focus on the issue at hand. That tank must go today." Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to find the tank still parked on the street, now adorned with a hand-painted sign reading, "Community Meeting Here, 10 a.m., and a string of colorful pennants. Robert stood beside it, distributing coffee from a large dispenser borrowed from his university department. Inside Margaret's house, the emergency meeting was deteriorating rapidly. "Before we vote on this," Barbara said, "I think we should address some other concerns that have come up recently." Margaret stiffened. "What concerns?" Barbara pulled out her phone. "I've been reviewing our financial statements. There are some irregularities regarding the landscaping reserve fund." "This is completely inappropriate," Margaret snapped. "We're here to discuss the tank situation." "Actually," Walter interjected, "as board members, we have a fiduciary duty to address any financial concerns that are raised." Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from Tom. "Coming home early. Need to talk." Through her dining room window, Margaret could see more neighbors gathering around the tank. Someone had brought donuts. The Pavel's children were drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. Mr. Kowalski was setting up a card table with what looked like petition forms. The doorbell rang again. Margaret excused herself, expecting to find Tom. Instead, Robert Chen stood on her doorstep, looking surprisingly formal in a blazer and tie, a thick portfolio under his arm. "Mrs. Holloway," he said politely, "I believe your emergency meeting is still in session. Perfect timing, as I have something all board members should see." Before Margaret could object, Robert stepped past her into the foyer, where the board members were now standing, curious about the interruption. "Mr. Chen has no authority to attend this private meeting," Margaret declared. "Actually," Robert replied, opening his portfolio, "as a homeowner in good standing, I have the right to attend any board meeting if I submit my request in writing, which I did by certified mail last night." He extracted a receipt. Section 6.1 of the bylaws. He turned to address the board directly. "And I believe you'll find what I've brought quite enlightening." Margaret's dining room had never felt so small. Robert stood at the head of the table where Margaret usually presided, methodically arranging documents from his portfolio. The board members watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Margaret remained standing, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded. Robert looked up calmly. "Presenting evidence of systematic bylaw violations and selective enforcement under your leadership, Mrs. Holloway." He slid a document toward each board member, a spreadsheet detailing every instance where Margaret had parked within 5 feet of his driveway over the past year, complete with time-stamped photographs. 67 violations, Robert explained. "By my calculation, at the standard fine of $100 per occurrence, that's $6,700 in penalties that were never assessed." Margaret's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. As HOA president, I occasionally need tow." "Make brief stops while performing your duties." Robert interrupted. "Yes, you mentioned that yesterday. Unfortunately, the bylaws don't include an exemption for the HOA president." Walter adjusted his glasses, examining the evidence. "He's right, Margaret. There's no exemption." "And here," Robert continued, producing another set of documents, "are 34 instances where Mrs. Holloway's holiday decorations remained up beyond the January 5th removal deadline, a violation she has fined others for repeatedly." Barbara's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. "These are very thorough, Mr. Chen." "I'm a history professor," Robert replied with a slight smile. "Documentation is my specialty." Outside, the crowd around the tank had grown. Through the window, Margaret could see at least 40 neighbors now, many holding coffee cups and engaged in animated conversation. Someone had brought a whiteboard on an easel. The doorbell rang again. Margaret moved to answer it, grateful for the interruption, only to find Jessica Miller standing there with a clipboard. "We have a petition," Jessica announced, "signed by 63 homeowners, a majority, calling for a special election of the HOA board." Behind Jessica stood Tom, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "I signed it too, Margaret," he said quietly. Margaret stared at her husband in disbelief. "You what?" Tom stepped past her into the house, nodding to the board members who had gathered in the foyer. "I'm sorry, but this has gone too far. The way you've been running things, it's not right." "Not right?" Margaret's voice rose dangerously. "I've dedicated 7 years to maintaining this neighborhood's standards. Property values are up 18% under my leadership." "At what cost?" Tom asked. "We don't even get invited to neighborhood barbecues anymore. Our neighbors crossed the street to avoid talking to you." A heavy silence fell. Margaret looked from face to face, finding no allies. "If you'll all follow me," Jessica said, "we're about to start the community meeting outside." One by one, the board members filed out of Margaret's house, Robert and Tom among them. Margaret remained frozen in her foyer, watching through her open door as her carefully constructed world collapsed. Outside, Robert had climbed onto the tank to address the gathered neighbors. "Today marks a new chapter for Oak Ridge Estates," he began. "For too long, our HOA has operated through intimidation rather than cooperation." Applause rippled through the crowd. Margaret stepped onto her porch, drawn to spite herself. I propose a complete revision of our bylaws, Robert continued, focusing on community building rather than punitive enforcement. More applause, louder this time. And as a first symbolic act, Robert announced, I move that we approve the Paddle's request for a teal front door, and any other color any homeowner wishes to paint their door. The crowd erupted in cheers. Mr. Patel, standing near the front, wiped tears from his eyes as neighbors patted his back. Margaret watched, stunned, as everything she had built unraveled before her eyes. She retreated inside and closed the door, leaning against it as the sounds of celebration continued outside. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother-in-law. Reviewed case. Can't help. Military vehicle display not prohibited by current enforceable laws. Recommend negotiation. 3 days later, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen island, scrolling through emails on her tablet. Her inbox, once filled with HOA business, neighborhood complaints, and vendor communications, now contained only promotional messages and a single note from Barbara about collecting Margaret's HOA files and office keys. The emergency election had been held the previous evening in the Millers' backyard. Margaret hadn't attended. Tom had gone, returning home with the news she already expected. A completely new board had been elected, with Robert Chen as president, Barbara as vice president, and a diverse group of neighbors filling the remaining positions. They created committees instead of having a single enforcement officer, Tom had explained gently. People are volunteering for community improvement projects. It's actually quite impressive how quickly they organized. Margaret had said nothing, pouring herself another glass of wine. Now watching through her window as neighbors chatted casually across driveways and children play freely on front lawns, she felt like a stranger in her own neighborhood. The Paddle's door had been painted a vibrant teal the day after the election. This morning, the Hendersons had installed a basketball hoop in their driveway. The Millers' rose bushes had somehow grown another 3 inches overnight, and yet property values hadn't plummeted. The neighborhood hadn't descended into chaos. Life simply went on, but with more smiles and friendly waves than Margaret could remember seeing in years. The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Margaret hesitated, then smoothed her shirt and went to answer. Robert Chen stood on her porch, looking different somehow, more relaxed in casual clothes without the formal intensity he displayed during their confrontations. Mrs. Holloway, he greeted her. I hope I'm not interrupting. Margaret's instinct was to shut the door, but curiosity won out. What do you want, Mr. Chen? Come to gloat. Robert shook his head. Actually, I came to invite you to join the Neighborhood Improvement Committee. We could use someone with your attention to detail and organizational skills. Margaret stared at him, certain this was some kind of joke. You can't be serious. I am, Robert insisted. Look, the tank served its purpose. It's gone now, back to Jason's collection. But what happened afterward? That wasn't just about opposing you. It was about building something better together. Through the open door, Margaret could see neighbors working on a community garden project in the common area. Tom was among them, laughing as he helped Mr. Kowalski plant something in a raised bed. Why would you want me involved? Margaret asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Everyone hates me. Nobody hates you, Robert said quietly. They hated being controlled. There's a difference. He handed her a folder, not unlike the one he used to present evidence against her, but thinner. These are the new committee structures and initial project proposals. The Financial Oversight Committee could particularly benefit from your experience. Margaret took the folder automatically, not opening it. We meet Thursday evenings at the Millers, Robert continued. Jessica makes excellent lemon bars. He paused. And for what it's worth, I think you really do care about this neighborhood. You just got caught up in the rules and forgot about the people. As Robert walked away, Margaret stood in her doorway, watching the community activity with new eyes. Children rode bikes without fear of violation notices. The Patels were distributing some kind of homemade treats to the garden volunteers. Even Diane, her formerly loyal ally, was helping install a little free library by the mailboxes. Margaret closed the door and looked down at the folder in her hands. For 7 years, she believed she was protecting Oak Ridge Estates through rigid enforcement of rules. She measured success in property values and compliance rates, never in smiles or connections. Tom came home an hour later, dirt on his knees and a contentment on his face Margaret hadn't seen in years. The community garden is going to be amazing, he announced, kicking off his shoes. We're putting in vegetables on one side, flowers on the other. The kids are designing stepping stones for the paths. He paused, noticing the open folder on the counter, Margaret's neat handwriting already filling the margins with notes. Robert came by, Margaret said, not looking up from her work. Apparently, the Financial Oversight Committee needs help reviewing the budget for these new projects.